You were a couple houses past most of it too.
Oh, yeah, that's Terry looks great.
Yeah.
Don't fall.
Used to have chickens.
Yeah.
Do I have to push something else?
He would threaten to shoot our dog. We had a hound dog. He would just say, my dad got so sick of the dog.
No.
He got tired of it. But then he jumped on the table.
Hello, everybody, and welcome tonight to the Lower Swatara Township Historic Preservation Society meeting. And we are very lucky tonight to have Ann Swartz here. And Ann is the daughter of Jim and Nancy, has been a lifelong resident of Lower Swatara Township in Middletown. And although she lived away during college and had an active duty career in the Army Nurse Corps, she retired from the military and returned here to finish raising her children. Now retired again from Penn State, she still enjoys the walk across the fields to what remains of their family cemetery. Retirement has allowed time for research with her Hummelstown Swartz cousin Ed and Paul, as well as travel to find Swartz Heinemann and Switzerland. Now I have just a couple announcements and then we'll let Ann start. I just want to say that we have our senior advisor, Ruth Shireman. Raise your hand, Ruth. She and I co-founded this organization, so it's nice to see her out. And our next speaker in July, on July 20th, will be Rick Farr, and he's going to talk about the Swatara Amusement Park. If anybody remembers that, it actually was in Lower Swatara Township. So, Ann tells me she has lots of stories, and she can go on and on. So I'm going to let her do that. Thanks, Ann.
Well, thank you so much for coming here. Thanks for inviting me, and I really appreciate all of you coming out. Try to clip this here. Is that going to work okay? Can you hear me? So, yeah, because I am a storyteller, I don't want to get carried away. So I very strictly told myself, get all of your notes written in here on the slides and read from your notes. Otherwise, you'll be here all night. But you can have questions afterward, and maybe I'll tell stories then. Jack still tried to get me going already. So did my brother and my cousin. All right, so Swartz Family and Cemetery. Little story I'm going to give you is about the Swiss Brethren folks who ended up here in Lower Swatara Township. Want to express gratitude. Not that fast. To my parents, Jim and Nancy, and my brothers Kurt and Tim is here. There's a nice mid-60s era family portrait. I think it's the only one we had all together. Gratitude also to my Hummelstown third cousins, Paul and Ed Swartz, to Mennonite Life in Lancaster, and their volunteer Joanne Segrist, who is a Nissley cousin and an expert on the Nissley family, and to Masthoff Publishing, and Lamar and Lois Mast. They're of Morgantown, and they do Swiss heritage tours, and I went on one of their tours last September. My agenda, my plan, I'm going to outline the story, tell you who we are, who we were, show you the homestead and the cemetery, discuss challenges of the research process, sort of summarize as I go what we know and significance for Lower Swatara, and encourage you to do your own research. So, even though I've lived here for 45 of the past 69 years, many of you may not know me, but maybe you know some of my family. So, I'll do a little introduction. I was born in Middletown, one long block from my Swartz grandparents' house on Spring Street. In 1960, my dad, Jim Swartz, you see here, I was his little darling, he moved us to Lower Swatara Township into, I gotta quit touching this thing, into Pete Messick's first development. It was called Green Plains, and it lay at the intersection of Route 441 and Fulling Mill Road. From that address, we could take a long walk across some fields and back a lane and see my Swartz ancestors' homestead and cemetery. We had Messick families all around us because the Messick family then owned and farmed the land where my ancestors and other families had once lived. The watercolor, it's one on the right, picture of our house, is a George Fiote original, for those of you who know George Fiote of Middletown, now Barry Township. He's a member of our church, St. Peter's Lutheran in Middletown. He played tennis with my dad. I live in this house again today with my 92-year-old mother, Nancy, who had fun re-looking up facts to make sure I didn't tell you something that wasn't true. The snow photo shows the Messick Drive turnoff from Fulling Mill Road, looking east toward Clifton Bridge over Swatara Creek, if you remember Clifton Bridge, sometime in the early 1960s. Growing up, we played in the dirt piles, the wheat and cornfields around our house, with the generous permission of the Messick family, as long as we did not crush the crops. Here's my brother Tim, with neighbor Timmy Gingrich in the late 60s, on land that belongs to Phoenix Contact today. We never thought about the fact that we might be playing in a field once worked by some long-gone Swartz, although that was the case. Here you can see a car moving, so behind Tim and Timmy, there's a car moving west on Fulling Mill Road. You might be able to see it. I can almost see it right there. I'm shaking hands. In the distance beyond that is where the field changes color. And that's about where there was a dirt lane that led back to the Swartz homestead. The Messick family had always welcomed my dad's family to hunt there, and we ate plenty of small game from this big backyard. The 60s and 70s were a heyday for small game in central PA. When he was out hunting or snagging fishing bait, or when we took our walks, we might do some informal cleanup at the cemetery. I imagine other family members did the same. There was no organized family maintenance plan for the cemetery. The Messicks promised not to disturb it, and I understand Hershey Creamery did the same when they purchased the property. I always appreciated knowing that when I looked out the front of our house, I saw the same line of rolling hills that the old Swartzes did from their front door. From a few high points, you can still see those hills today, as here from the hill in Old Reliance. This used to be the landscape you would walk through to reach the Swartz Nissley Cemetery. And next to it is a shortened version of my family tree that reaches back to those who lived at the homestead and were buried there, to the first generation that would have known anything about the homestead or would have experienced it, lived there. Some of you might know my brothers. Kurt is now in Philadelphia, his children married in New York. Tim lives in Londonderry Township, his children in Lower Swatara and Hummelstown. Our connection, of course, was through my father's Swartz family. So, if this is not making sense to you, this is a tree from Ancestry. I don't know if any of you use Ancestry. So, we have, we're doing this. So, me, Brother Kurt, Brother Tim, here's my dad, Jim Swartz, his sister, Louise Swartz, Oliver Swartz, and then the next generation, and my great-grandparents. So my dad's father, Oliver, was a general practitioner who delivered many of the babies in Middletown and Lower Swatara. And his father, up at the top, Oliver Martin Swartz, lived 1866 to 1923. He was of the last generation to be born on the homestead in Lower Swatara. They were the generation, perhaps, to begin assimilating and modernizing by leaving farming. Ooh, here's a whole bunch more. And I don't know, can you see the blue scribbles I've done on here that were supposed to be helpful? Sort of? Sort of, sorry. But people often ask, are you related to those other Swartzes? And sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes it is no. So here's the rundown. My father, Jim, worked for the Patriot News. and was for many years on the Middletown School Board and the Lower Swatara Township Rec Board. My mother was the school nurse at Londonderry Township Elementary School. My father's sister, Louise Maxwell, was a teacher there, and she and her husband had a small farm and picture framing business on Round Top Road. Their daughter, Mary Lacey, was a teacher also and still lives in town. My father's older brother, Oliver, like their father, was a physician, and he retired from the Carlisle Barracks Dunham Clinic. His daughter still lives in town. So here, I'm talking about this generation right here. So now we'll go up to my grandfather. People thought of him as old Doc Swartz, and his generation, his brothers and sister. My grandfather, Oliver Swartz Sr., came from a large family of big, athletic, and boisterous individuals, both male and female characters, who told wonderful stories about their championship sports teams at Middletown High School, about gang fights in Middletown, and general troublemaking and mischief. But of all the stories they told, there were none about where exactly we came from and how we came to be here. So thanks a lot, guys. You would be most likely to know descendants of his brother Bob, a state policeman who enjoyed the horse races, whose son Bobby moved to Virginia and his son became a DC policeman, his daughter Mary Benson maybe, who stayed in this area to raise her daughter Shelley, or his brother Saul, who worked for the Patriot News and the Philadelphia Inquirer, had many grandchildren who have mostly remained local, and you might have known them as the twins, Valerie and Saul, Mayor of Royalton in his retirement, Mitch and Mike, athletes, Bull Swartz, attorney Melissa Barilla, and Paul Brady's family. Young Brady is my neighbor today on Messick Drive. My great-grandfather's generation, the fifth and the assimilation generation, lost their father early. They were 5 boys, ranging in age from 6 to 14, when their father, Martin Nissley Cemetery, died in 1878. And these are these folks right here. So here's Martin Nissley and his wife, or Oliver Martin and his wife, Sarah Rose. Martin Nissley, who passed away at a fairly young age up here. Martin was born on the homestead and raised by his grandparents, Christian Swartz and Elizabeth Mumaw, his own parents dying in their 30s. Martin had chosen agriculture as his occupation. He was a stockholder in the Mechanics Bank of Harrisburg and a member of the United Brethren Church. When he left his wife, Harriet Wallower Swartz, a widow, his 51-year-old brother, Solomon Landis Swartz, assisted in raising his nephews, 5 boys. Uncle Saul sternly advised that they learn a trade or go to school. They would not be continuing to farm, and that is what happened. Like good Anabaptists, they were not early adopters of photography, so please forgive me for my dearth of early images of people. They just do not exist. So, these 5 boys who are told no more farming, learn a trade, go to school. The oldest of this assimilation generation, the 5th generation, was Christian Landis Swartz. He was educated at Lebanon Valley, worked for American Tube and Iron, and moved his family to Hummelstown, where they became numerous and some lines left the area. For a time, some of his descendants farmed the homestead land even after it was sold. These local Swartzes were Brethren and later Methodist. Christian's descendants gave us gas pumps on Middletown Road, so this is one of the photos in the upper left. A snack shack on the square in Hummelstown, some of you might remember that. Later, a pretzel business. An environmental conservationist and beekeeper, that would be my cousin Paul, a Washington, D.C. attorney and wood carver, old Christian, who's no longer with us, a candidate for Pennsylvania governor on the constitutional ticket in 1965. Vote for Ed Swartz, that was Ed Sr. A veterinary surgeon and Londonderry Township supervisor, Ed Jr., and Indian Echo Caverns, still run today by one of Ed Jr.'s daughters. Oh my, finger happy. The 3 youngest sons, Joshua, Isaac, and Elijah. attended either Lebanon Valley or Shippensburg and then Dickinson Law. They went into practice together in Harrisburg, practicing corporate law and being involved in politics. In faith, they were either Lutheran or Brethren. Joshua Jr. did not marry, so Josh Sr. was married, had a son, Joshua Jr., both attorneys. Joshua Jr. did not marry, had no children, so no more Swartzes from that line. But every time you drive out 441 the whole way to the mall, you pass their house up on the left on the hill. Isaac Benjamin married Eliza Trillinger. Her family was of Swatara Township. Farmers also. They have one living descendant, that's his house on Walnut Street, but they have one living descendant in Harrisburg today, through a daughter, so no longer carrying the surname. And handsome Elijah Gabriel died very suddenly. He had typhoid fever. He and his young wife, Mary Emma Boozer, of an Oberlin family, lived in town and had no children. So the last one in that generation was my great-grandfather, Oliver Martin Swartz. He learned the trade of stove molder, which used to be, stoveworks in town. He worked there for 12 years. Then he opened a grocery store. Here you see him in his grocery store, which he ran out of his house on Spring Street. He served on the town council, later as Burgess of Middletown, and was a delegate to the state convention. Oliver Martin Swartz was a Methodist. Now this accounts for the full 5th generation, the assimilation generation that left the farm. Oliver Martin Swartz's son, my grandfather, was locally known for a few things. His hour-long office appointments, always unscheduled, that included a lot of storytelling and interaction with his mechanical monkey collection. His skill as a turkey hunter and specialty turkey collars made from turkey bones. So that's what this article is about. He was demonstrating how do you make a turkey collar. He used to teach us how to work that thing. And then this property on Spring Street in Middletown, once part of a tannery, later his home and office, shown here after an airplane crashed into it during World War II. Many people still remember that plane crash, and shows you the fire trucks and the hoses trying to put the fire out over here. Pop, as we called him, still understood some spoken German, and he could speak a little dialect. He enjoyed doing that with his rural patients. He told us so many stories, but not really where we came from. He told us the best cheese in the world came from the Emmental in Switzerland, and once I got to taste some when a friend had made him a gift. A few times I remember him telling the story of Jacob Amann and Hans Reist and their conflict that was the start of the Amish division. But he never told us that Jacob Schwartz of the Emmental was part of that story. Did he even know, I wonder? My brother Kurt and sometimes my cousin Mary Lou say they knew we were from Switzerland and we were Anabaptists, but I don't know if I believe them. Old Doc Swartz was raised in Wesley United Methodist Church in Middletown, and he often said that the most important day of his life was the day he accepted Jesus Christ as his Savior in a ceremony at Wesley. So like his Anabaptist ancestors who supported rebaptism of adults, he embraced the importance of choosing when one is old enough to understand the significance of the choice and of baptism. But what about the cemetery, right? When's she gonna talk about that? Here we go. I think these photos were taken by Charlie Fees. Some of you might have known Charlie Fees of Middletown. I think he took them in the late 1990s. Charlie was trying to visit and record as many local cemeteries as possible. About this one, he also recorded the condition, with many stones lined up against 2 of the stone walls and some lying on top of the wall. He did not describe moving anything. Earlier in the 90s, probably before July 1993, when I moved to Texas with my kids, I had visited the vandalized graveyard with my young children and leaned some of the strewn but unbroken stones against the walls, thinking to protect them. There were still many stones present at that time, and I did not remove anything. The broken stones I left where they lay. The last time I visited during the pandemic with my children and my son-in-law, the gate was still intact, but the place was so overgrown with poison ivy that we were afraid to approach. In this section of the presentation, I will try to answer the questions listed on the slide that were presented by members of your association. The research challenges begin immediately and continue to present throughout. Let's start with, is it still there? Short answer is yes. Anyone familiar with Reynolds' excellent article on some of the Nissley homes, and it's cited on your society's website, you'll recognize this photo and quote. Although this was a peer-reviewed academic article, the author nevertheless makes some unreferenced declarations. The paper's unrivaled in recording and assessing the architecture of 5 stone dwellings, all with relationships to the Nissley family, and one of them is the Christian Swartz house. But some of the commentary, such as this example about the cemetery, begged for more detail and citations. Nancy Nissley Swartz is most likely not interred at the cemetery. This pile of crushed rocks was not all that remained in 1991. And to fling some of the stones all the way to Swatara Creek, so anybody from around here knows, that's a long way. So this is sort of a Paul Bunyan-esque feat. That's quite a toss. So what are we really being told? Did Reynolds collect a story about a stone identified as from this graveyard being found in the creek? Or did she hear a story about the Vandals themselves and their specific activities? If so, that kind of information should have been shared. As it is written, it's a sort of drama implying that the cemetery is gone. So I'm not trying to offer a critique of her article. It's wonderful. But when you look for something other than the descriptions of the house, then you hone in on something different. And it raises an issue. So where is it? If you use Google today and Google Swartz Nissley Cemetery, this map comes up. So let's see. Can you see where we are? So that, of course, is a cemetery. This is the newest part of Old Reliance. Up here's Swartz. This is Longview Drive. Down here's Crider Chicken Farm. Out here is Fulling Mill Road, FedEx, the whole industrial park. The dial-up era Roots web post that Charlie Fees made, it's now on Ancestry. Loads of people can find it. It still tells us what Charlie Fees reported almost 25 years ago, that the location of the cemetery is Lower Swatara Township, Dauphin County, 1 mile south on Farm Lane, off Longview Drive, formerly called Swartz's Farm. And then it says, courtesy of Beverly Reed Swartz and Ann Swartz, submitted by Charlie Fees. So I become implicated. I have no idea what route Charlie Fees took to arrive at the cemetery. There was no Google or MapQuest. Today, there is no Farm Lane. I don't know if there was back then. I don't know what he meant by Farm Lane. It is not clear which farm it would have led to, lying north of the site, because north of the site is like not a lot. 2 old farms and not a lane called Farm Lane. Strites, that's Strites Road. Farmhouse Lane runs more east-west and ends well before the cemetery. So somebody tried to find the cemetery, they might get this, but if they didn't know the area, they'd read Charlie's old directions from 25 years ago and they would never find it. So let's look at a map. Do you remember what those look like? Ooh, no, that kind of map. There we go. Scary map. So I was so excited when I found this. I was trying to create my own overlay of today's roads on the old warranty map. Well, what a mess. And then I found someone had done it, and for $14 I could buy it and all sorts of explanations about how to use it, so that was a really good purchase. This is most of Lower Swatara Township, showing an overlay of today's roads onto the original warranty map. The township is outlined in navy blue. Not all of it is on this slide. Today's roads are in red, and the warranty map is in black. So if you've ever looked at that warranty map, you're recognizing that. So let's take a moment to orient ourselves. We know that parcel 16 was the Swartz property and parcel 28 belonged to Johannes Nissley. So right here, we know that Swartz property, and this one, here's Johannes Nissley. You can see that Fulling Mill Road cuts through the Swartz farm that now encompasses an industrial park and Phoenix Contact. So here's Fulling Mill Road, right there. The land stretched south and beyond 283. I never knew that until I put this presentation together. I think I saw it once years ago and it didn't really register. So we know that was woodland because it was woodland when I grew up. And north beyond the streams, and most of the township was woodland early on. Beyond the streams, let's see, but not as far as Longview Drive. That area is not developed. That's the northern portion. So up here, the streams, the runs, which are still there, and Longview Drive. This part is not developed, and of course there's talk about development there all the time. The Nissley property wrapped around the corner, encompassing the streams, and ran up to Longview Drive. Messick Drive, where I live at the Fulling Mill 441 intersection, would have been Ishnauer property. So this was Ishnauer 15A, and down here, this little circle is Messick Drive. Researchers like to use reliable sources, and one we all know is Eagle's Notes and Queries of Pennsylvania, right? The 1897 Series 3, Volume 1 details the work of at least 2 writers for Harrisburg's The Telegraph. That was the home of Notes and Queries. The writers were native to Highspire, and they wrote, "The next farm graveyard we visited was the Swartz Nissley, on the lines of the farms of I.B. Nissley, A. Whitmer, and M. Swartz, in full view of the Fisher Farm, made historic from the pear, which bears that name and where it was first grown." So we know that the cemetery sits here on the Swartz-Nissley line. And so I'm guessing from that description, Whitmer had land over here, the Fisher Farm was up here, the orchard was up here on the hill. I wonder if that became part of Strite's orchard. I have no idea, just a guess. Today, the most accurate way to cite the location using street addresses would be about 0.4 miles south off Longview Drive. So you can see this is Longview Drive, down here's the cemetery, it's 0.4 miles, and 300 some feet. 300 feet behind 1332 and 1340 Pheasant Run Road in Old Reliance. In 2018, I wrote to Paul Swartz, "Yes, the homestead was much closer to Fulling Mill Road," meaning the house, than to Longview. The entrance lane opened from Fulling Mill, and it ended at the house and the barn. And I still remember when the barn burned down. We had a lot of barn burnings. That would be an interesting presentation if somebody remembered about those barn burnings. The house faced east, looking toward the creek. You had to walk down a hill, across a stream, then across another field or two to reach the graveyard. From the graveyard, you could view Longview Drive and the Nissley farm. So here, I'm talking about that big Mark Nissley's farm up here. The stream now lies at the edge of the industrial park that has replaced the houses. You can see the industrial park through the trees in this right-hand photo. So you see up here, this is industrial. But back to Eagle's Notes and Queries for a moment. The Swartz-Nissley Cemetery entry continued. Not here, as is too frequently found in other places, do we find the place in a neglected condition, but a spacious burial place enclosed by a new stone wall, protected by a well-painted wooden cap or coping. An artistically wrought gate is on the western end of the yard. The following are the inscriptions. So clearly that was an old description. For this presentation, the inscriptions will be detailed after we've established the where is it. Another brief report found at Mennonite Life in their files for the Swartz Nissley Cemetery repeated an edited version of Egel's description. They talked about the enclosure, the stones, the wooden coping, the iron gate, and they finished with, note, very well kept in 1947. Apparently a few unmarked graves, all other markers in place. So it appears this person visited with a copy of Egel's list of who's buried there in order to check the condition of the cemetery and compare the list with the tombstones still present. There's no explanation of their conclusion that a few graves were unmarked or who those graves might be. So it was an interesting thing to find, but it doesn't tell me anything. So on to the next question. Who is buried there? Answering this question throws us deep into the research challenges. Any family researcher first scouring the internet for information on the Swartz Nissley Cemetery will easily retrieve this chart. Charlie Fees posted this. We're back to that same old Roots web post, courtesy of Beverly Reed Swartz and Ann Swartz, submitted by Charlie Fees. It looks pretty organized if I were doing research and trying to make an initial assessment. It cites Egel, who I know from reading the original does not share that the tombstones were etched in Old German script. We see that the earliest birth date is for Christian Swartz, born February 27, 1731, an immigrant from Germania. We wonder if that immigration and relationship information was on the tombstones, because it says this is a list of what's on the tombstones. But, you know, sometimes there's a lot of info on a tombstone. Then we notice there are people sharing the Swartz surname, Beverly and Ann, contributing data. That seems good, right? It's a good sign. But who were they? Well, Bev was married to Solomon Swartz Jr., parents of the multiple sets of twins in Middletown. She was interested in genealogy, as is her son Mike. Their family had created an extensive family tree for a reunion in the early 1990s, and I think that my Aunt Louise Maxwell had something to do with that too. Bev was a friend of Charlie Fees. Charlie knew my parents. Okay. My contribution to Charlie Fees included data collected on site at the cemetery by my brother Kurt, about 1974 when he was still in high school. Kurt and I both had high school German in Middletown with Mrs. Tucker. Some of you might remember Mrs. Tucker in German class. And I also did the German sequence in college. Then in the Army, I lived in Stuttgart, Germany for 3 years. We thought we really knew what we were doing with German. So, continuing on with the same Charlie Fees Roots web post that I talked about previously, we find, wait a minute. On the same web post, we have the list and then we have this. Two very different birth dates for the same immigrant. 1731 and now it's November 1745. And two supposedly reliable sources. Egel's Notes and Queries and now the history of Dauphin and Lebanon counties. And now we have comments from 3 family members. We're adding Solomon Swartz. Solomon Landis. So 3 family members are commenting, this seems so legitimate. We have new researchable information. Now we know the size of the property, some history in Berks County, but we actually know far less than when we started. Paul, Ed, and I have spent many years working out who was Christian Swartz the immigrant. Without slogging through that whole process, I share the next 2 slides as examples of one bit of research analysis that I completed for this presentation. Sort of embarrassing. You don't need to take it all in, just let it create an impression. It's overwhelming. And I will explain what it is and what it tells us. Gasp, right? Using Charlie Fees' published list as a base, I compared it to its documented source. I read the Agel Notes and Queries original source, not just as quoted by Charlie Fees. Anything you see in parentheses, which is mostly birth dates or miscellaneous remarks, if there are parentheses, that means it did not appear in the original source in Agel, and they were added by Charlie Fees. So apparently, his goal was to help family historians who were doing family searches while also documenting the cemetery, but he did not identify all of his creative additions nor their sources. And this continues on the rest of the list, which is on the next page. So then I returned to 4 more lists of graves. And by the way, these were a file that we found at Mennonite Life. We've had them for like 6 years. And they were lists from different people, usually unnamed. And it was just so overwhelming. And we cared about figuring out the immigrant. So we didn't look at it. And then Paul reminded me of this list when I told him about this presentation. And I looked at it and I thought, oh my heavens. It's like all these lists you see, I have them in different colors. I thought I have to look at it. So I compared all the details and calculated inferred birth dates whenever they gave an age of death. What did I learn? Well, one list with no author does not include most of the Nissleys, nor the Swartz infants. They leave out some dates, they add a lot of date and age of death information. Audrey Rutherford, whose list is sometimes cited in other writing, she made the same exclusions, used a different spelling for Nissley, either made transcription errors or calculated different inferences on a few of the dates, birth dates, and misidentified a husband. And this is all to be found at Mennonite Life, more reasonable sources. These seem to be family historians with an interest in tracing specific lines, like maybe a Nissley line. One person, the one in blue, just made a site visit in 1947, and I talked about that in the previous slide. But most intriguing was the 4th list. The 4th list, it's in purple. It's typed, it's undated, it gives no author, it simply states, Samuel Heisey Farm, Lower Swatara Township. Dandy. I grew up with Heiseys. I can't remember any particular Heisey, but I thought, oh, that's a familiar name. That's a German name. Well, it's not on any of the maps. It's not on the warranty map. It's not on 1858, 65, 75, whatever those 3 maps are. Is there anybody in this room who knows of a Samuel Heisey Farm? If you ever come across someone who knows, please tell me, because I'm dying to find out. Because what this says, that list, Samuel Heisey Farm, Lower Swatara Township, this list of graves. Jacob Swartz. Jacob Swartz was the son of the immigrant. Christian, Jacob, his 2 sons. It says Jacob Swartz is also buried at Samuel Heisey's farm. Dauphin County history gives him as being unmarried, and we have never thought of him as anything but unmarried. There's like no one else, no other record. In Agel and all their records, he's listed as buried in the Swartz Nissley Cemetery. The Christian and Elizabeth, who would be in the Swartz Cemetery, the 2nd generation, Jacob's brother is Christian Swartz, married to Elizabeth Mumal. They appear to be his generation on this Heisey list, but the dates are completely wrong. So I don't know who this other Christian Swartz is supposed to be. I don't even know if Elizabeth is meant to be his wife, but it does look like they're of the same age range, so they probably were husband and wife. And then the children with no surnames, inexplicable. You see Francis, and I know we have Francis, or we have Fanny Landis, but it's Francis Arlene. It makes no sense. But there it is, again, in file. The wife of Solomon Landis is also listed, Solomon Landis Swartz, and she is buried in the Swartz Nissley Cemetery, but she's listed on this Heisey list, and the dates are off by a decade for her birth and her death. It's all inexplicable. So now I wonder, did Jacob Swartz actually have a family? I mean, that's the thing that comes to mind. You have to investigate. In communication with Joanne Segrist, who works with Mennonite cemetery projects, I learned that veterans are sometimes honored with a plaque in cemeteries other than the one where they were buried. Well, we have no veterans in these early eras. These people were Anabaptists. And another Nissley researcher, Barbara Lindemuth, has an ancestor who was widowed and remarried, then buried in one graveyard and honored with a memorial in another. But this was not a customary practice. So I have no idea what any of this means. Find a grave, which is very popular with family historians. Are any of you familiar with Find a Grave? Yeah, so you look up graves there, yeah. And you think, wow, this is wonderful, because they often find graves that you didn't know where they were. Here's a photo. Well, it appears to be helpful because they give you German text from these photos. So it looks really special, like, wow, they even went to the trouble of telling you what the German is. But they only complicate the matter by providing inaccuracies. So much for documented listings. So, what do? What do the remaining gravestones themselves tell us? 6 tombstone photos appear online on Find a Grave. Paul Swartz might have photographed this first one, that's the earliest Christian Swartz, because since 2019, Paul has had this tombstone under protection in his home. But he's not sure if he took that picture. The rest of the photos are unattributed, so we have no idea. Someone made an effort to photograph graves from the Swartz Nissley Cemetery, but we don't know who they are. And it's not, you think, oh, well, can't you just look on Find a Grave and see? Oh, it's not that easy. Sometimes you have to click through a couple different people. Many of them don't want to answer an email from you, or they'll say, we do not take emails, because they're volunteers. They might manage 4,000 graves. And then to try to find the photographer, and I've done this already for another person. I found the photographer and he couldn't remember where he found the photo. So if you're researching, yes, if you're just trying to fill in your family tree, it makes you feel really good, because here's a photo and here's some information. But do you know if it's correct? No, you do not. You don't even know if the photo's real, except we know from looking at these, yeah, this looks like it's real. We have no idea who took the pictures. The birth and death information on this slide is what our combined research has agreed upon. And I'll tell you more about that as we go along. Christian Swartz, the immigrant. I assessed the script, the German script, a few years ago. I used a Proctor guide and translated to English using Langenscheid's German English Dictionary. The text means, here lies Christian Swartz, died on the 27th of April, 1803. His age was 57 years. And there's a missing number for the months and several days. My reasoning in arriving at the date range that we came to. Jahr, J-A-H-R, the word for year, Jahr is singular. So we know he's 57, that is clear. So we expect there's a missing E for Jahr, and then a missing number. Monat for months, monat is also singular. If this were multiple months, it would be monate, it would be plural. So the missing number of months must be either 0 or 1. Tag appears singular, but as a phrase, etliche Tag means several days. It does not mean a few days, as given on Find a Grave. So that might be equivalent, but a few and several are different. They are both undefined. But clearly they did not use Langenscheid's dictionary. Who knows what several means? Is it more than a couple or a few? I don't know. But by this reasoning, the birthday window would be approximately mid to late, no later than the 26th of March or April 1746, not February, which is what Find a Grave tells you. The date of death we agreed upon, April 27th, 1803. It is agreed upon, except by one named list author at Mennonite Life, who wrote August 27th, 1803, and that was probably a misreading. So, there's agreement on the death. All published birth dates were probably reasoned backwards based on the age of death, as read from a tombstone in German. Even the tombstone in its destroyed state shows 57 years. It's unmistakable. Previous translations of 1 week and 1 day would appear to be incorrect. After following up all the documented Christian Swartzes we could find from this era in history in Pennsylvania, the closest published birth date data we currently possess is for Christian Swartz, immigrant, born 1713, who was born in the Jura Mountains in Samboval in the bishopric of Basel, which is now part of Switzerland. And his son Christian was born on 23 April 1746. It's good enough until we change our minds again. There are no photos of second generation tombstones for Swartz. In the third generation tombstones, you notice the surname spelling keeps changing, and this was true in the Swiss records as well. No discernible pattern for how and why it changes. So I guess if I want to add a CH and remove the T from my name, I could do that. I agree, in this case, with find a grave, which does the translation. So I agree with their translation, I agree with the date, the translation agrees with my brother Kurt's transcription, and notice this one uses the correct plurals for Yara, Manata, and Taga. In many lists for the Swartz Nissley Cemetery in this third generation, Christian III's wife, Nancy Landis Nissley Swartz, is also included as buried in the Swartz Nissley Cemetery, and there might have been a stone for her at one time. However, Abel does not record a grave for Nancy Nissley. Nancy was widowed, very young, and remarried, moving to the West Shore while her children were raised here on the farm by their Swartz grandparents, probably with help from Aunt Maria and Uncle Solomon Landis, who were neighbors who had no children of their own. I mean, they were family, but they were also neighbors. Sadly, Nancy also died in her early 30s, as recorded by this fine tombstone on the right in Camp Hill, Cumberland County. It is uncertain where she was actually laid to rest. And I mean, you can reason that through all sorts of ways, but there's no way to know. Except you kind of bet on the place that has the tombstone, the nice tombstone. These are just the other 3 photographed stones, and they represent, so Rudolph Martin and his wife were sister to third generation, and her husband, sister to Landis, I think. And then these were 2 babies in the last generation that used the cemetery. And I'm guessing maybe the cemetery was getting full. They started burying over here in Ebenezer and in Middletown. So here's another scary genealogy chart, but who is really buried in the Swartz Nissley Cemetery? Well, we have the eldest generations of 2 neighboring families. So over here, we have Christian Swartz and his wife, Magdalena Good. And then we have Johannes Nissley, Reverend Johannes Nissley, and his wife, Barbara Hertzler. They are definitely buried there, or were buried there. Then a variety of descendants down to the 5th generation, and I told you about some of the direct Swartz descendants. Some were born on the farm, some were born in Lancaster County. The first generation, Swartz, Good, Nissley, and Hertzler, were all Swiss brethren families. So let's try to take in all the family names of the earliest generations and not just those who were buried there. Just tuck them back in your head. Note that in the 2nd generation, Swartz marries Muma, so Muma, another family from the township, a Mennonite family from Germany, via Mount Joy in Donegal Township. The 1st generation mother in the Muma family was a Longenecker, another Swiss brethren family. The 2nd generation of Nissley marries a daughter of Felix Landis, also a Swiss brethren family. Note that in the 3rd generation, so down here, Sister Maria, we have Christian Swartz, Maria Swartz. She marries a Landis as well. It was brother of that Landis who married a Martin. And Paul Swartz has that Rudolph Martin tombstone as well. I asked him, why did you choose that one? He didn't tell me. I don't know why he took those 2, but those are the 2 that he has at his house. So Maria Swartz and Solomon Landis were not buried here, even though they lived in the township. And I think, as I said, I think the graveyard was getting full by that time. Solomon Swartz, in the next generation, buried his first wife here, and then his second wife was Annie Wagner. But after that first wife was buried here, all but a few babies were being buried in Ebenezer, next to the Brethren Church, or in Middletown. Maria Swartz and Solomon Landis acquired a good bit of property in Lower Swatara Township, but they were unlucky with their family. None of their children survived to adulthood. There is a story in some Landis family histories that Solomon's death was by suicide at the age of 70. I just learned that again as I was doing this research. After Maria was widowed in 1868, the 1870 census shows her in Middletown, quite wealthy in real estate and personal goods, which makes sense. And living with her is a 15-year-old Maria Swartz. Now, if this were her own daughter, she'd be quite old to have had a 15-year-old daughter, and the girl's name would have been Landis. So who is this Maria Swartz, born in 1855? Another new thing, another mystery that I found preparing for this. Was she the daughter of Maria's nephew, Samuel Swartz, and his wife, Christiana Eschnauer? I don't know. It's an example of how one piece of clarification leads to new questions. Remember that the fourth generation was the last to farm the Swartz homestead? Widowed at 42, just months after losing her only daughter, age 8, Harriet Wallenor Swartz was left with a farm to manage and 5 boys to raise alone. She had to be grateful for the help given by her brother-in-law, Solomon Landis Swartz, and perhaps grateful that he directed her sons away from farming. In 1899, Ruth Sharman shared this obituary with me. In 1899, Harriet's obituary called her an aged woman when she died, just 62 years old. And I had to laugh because I saw 62 a number of years ago. I didn't know I was aged. Members of the fourth generation buried in the Swartz Nissley Cemetery were Mary Craybill. So Craybill always rings the bell, not just because we have Graybills in Middletown, but Craybill, these are all basically the same family. Graybill was the leader, he was one of the 2 leaders of the radical Reformation movement in Switzerland. So that tells you something about the family line that she came from. So she's buried in the Swartz Nissley Cemetery, as is Solomon's brother, Samuel, who was quite young when he died. In the fourth generation, many cemetery lists show Samuel Swartz died as a young child, like 4 years old. But census records and wills prove he lived to adulthood, perhaps even lived for a short time with his newly remarried mother, Nancy Nissley Swartz Shop. He married a neighbor, Christiana Eschnauer, a marriage that her father encouraged in his will. That was a funny finding. This is to be yours. This will be yours, Christiana, if you get married. In the 1870 census, Christiana Swartz was listed as a 22-year-old widow, living with Mary, her 48-year-old widowed mother here in the township, and her 10-year-old brother. No other child is listed, so it appears that Samuel and Christiana did not have children before he died at age 30, or their child was not living with her. This is Solomon Landis Swartz's home, and again, you pass this on Route 441. Solomon Landis Swartz of the fourth generation continued to own and farm some land on the homestead, but he also purchased his own land and this home on Route 441, near Ebenezer United Brethren Church. After being widowed, his second wife was Annie Wagner, a Lower Swatara Township neighbor. They did not have children. And here you can see the proximity of Solomon's house and land. So he's over here in the trees, that's his house, here in these trees, and right down here was the church, where he was very involved. He was also active in establishing the United Brethren Church on Chambers Hill, and later served as a minister at the Middletown EUB Church. He and Annie retired to Union Street in Middletown. I promised that after introducing the Swartz family and exploring the cemetery, I would build a case for them being part of a Swiss Brethren community in the township. So that's what I'll do here. In the cemetery, you heard the names and saw the intermarriage and family connections among the buried family members. So now I want to look at some property documents and see what they can show us. And finally, make a quick reach back to Switzerland, where there will be more pretty photos and fewer of the words. Here again is the original warranty map overlaid. The overlay was created by McInnes and McInnes. The properties of interest mostly had their patents being issued in the first decade of the 1800s, some as late as 1831. But the original warrant applications may have begun in the 1730s, followed by surveys. The land had already been possessed then and often improved and lived upon by different families for much of a century before awarding of the final patent. Number 16 was Schwarzwald, the Black Forest farm, patented for the second generation brothers Christian and Jacob Swartz. So again, it doesn't quite make sense why Jacob would be buried on Heisey's land when he was patented to this property along with his brother. The neighboring parcel 15A was Amsterdam farm, went to Christian Ischnauer, and we heard Samuel Swartz in the next generation marries an Ischnauer girl. To the other side, parcel 20 was originally procured by Richard McClure, and parcel 20A became Johannes Nissley's farm, Richland. And the houses on that property are on your website, McClure House and the house that Nissley built. Parcel 23, it's a little triangle down here, belonged to this right here. Belonged to Felix Landis, so he was father of these different Landises you've been hearing about. Belonged to Felix Landis, and he left it to, I think he's a nephew, but he left it when he died to a younger Nissley. Nissley, I think. And that's what you see on the patent map, that it was Landis's left to Nissley. Johannes Mumaw's Fresh Ford farm was the home of Elizabeth Mumaw. So you probably know about this property because Johannes Mumaw gave the land for the Mennonite church, which then became Shope's church later when Shope's owned the land. 46, 4F, G, and H. So these just interest me. They're down here, 46 and then 4F, G, H. These are little properties, but you see they're right along Fulling Mill. And what's down here? Goodville House, Christian Good, and others. So this was like a group purchase. Christian Good and a bunch of other people bought this land, and then he built this woolen mill. There are 3 generations of goods that we know about. So I am digging and digging, but I have not found yet how he might be connected with Magdalena Good, but I'm certain that he is. Good family is a huge family. The immigrant generation, there were 4 mothers, and each one there were like 6 to 8 children. So it's a big family, but someday I will find it. Finally, the Fiddler's Elbow property, well past what we know as Elbow Farm. This place out here. This is the creek going around it, the part that sticks out in the creek and practically touches Indian Echo Cave over here. Here's North Union Street. So to get to this now, it's the UPS, right? So you gotta go the whole way back there, long drive. I tried to do that the other day, but you have to be an employee. So that's important. It was patented in 1812 to Daniel Engel, and you're thinking, well, so what? Well, right now, I just want you to remember that name, Engel. So remember especially these names: Swartz, Nissley, Good, Landis, and Engel. You've heard all of them numerous times now. Don't even try to read this. But this comes from Ed Swartz's research. Ed found the deed for this land. So long before it was patented to Christian and Jacob, it was purchased by Christian Schwartz. So this is the deed for Christian and Jacob's Schwarzwald, Black Forest farm. What we notice here in this wash of text that is significant, so I put the significant stuff in blue, but again, I'll just tell you what it is. Someone named Joseph Brand purchased the land from Samuel Hannah, the original warranty, and this is on the warranty map. Remember the surname Brand. The Brands have 2 daughters, who are married to 2 brothers of Magdalena Good Swartz. They are Christian Good and Samuel Good. We know from previous research that Christian Schwartz recently sold his land in Brecknock Township, like 1785, I think. Here we see that the Brands and the Goods are also of Brecknock Township. Now that Joseph Brand has died, his property in Lower Swatara goes to a huge group of heirs, who all agree to sell the property to Christian Schwartz first. And among those heirs are this Christian Good. His land is a package of 209 acres. It's bounded by McClure and Nissley land. Well, we established that before, that makes sense. Sale is final to Christian Schwartz. Everything fits neatly with what we've already seen. Now we know when Christian first possessed the homestead, March 1786. He was about 40 years old. Here's the homestead house, as pictured in the Reynolds article about Nissley homes and in a snapshot on the left taken by my father in 1980. Remember when film was very dear and it was expensive to develop it, and you just had a little brownie camera? So that's what happens to the film over time, as you know. Not much difference between these two. It was a tenant property for many years. When it was torn down for industrial park development, the 1799 cornerstone found its way to Ed Swartz. So, cousin and brother, if you ever wonder, now you know, that's where that went. And I forget, somebody from the township, someone who owned land near the homestead, retrieved that and gave it to Ed. More interesting than the house, even though the house is really interesting in that Reynolds article, more interesting are the people who lived there. Christian Schwartz, who built this house, arrived in Philadelphia in 1754 with his father, Christian Schwartz, and his uncles, Peter and Hans. They were part of a group of Anabaptists led by Ulrich Engel. Remember, I told you to remember that surname. The Phoenix, their ship, was accompanied by 2 merchant ships which carried the cargo of the immigrants, one of which was lost in a violent storm at sea. Christian's father apparently died while migrating from Philadelphia. The uncles were both taxed in Mountjoy, Donegal Township, Lancaster. Young Christian settled in Brecknock Township, Lancaster County, when he reached adulthood. Not sure where he was in between. His marriage to Magdalena Good is documented in Mennonite history and also in her father, Christian Good's will. The Goods were of Brecknock Township. In the history of Dauphin and Lebanon counties, and I fully acknowledge that these stories were all retrieved from family members, so they tend to be very laudatory. I'm sure you all know this. So everyone sounds pretty good unless they did something really bad, in which case they probably didn't get into the book. But I like to believe nice things about my ancestors, so I will share them. We read that Christian Schwartz, the first who built this house, the child immigrant, was a man of more than ordinary ability who made many improvements on his farm. His 2 sons, Christian and Jacob, lived with him on his farm until his death. His son, Christian II, was a farmer and a very religious man, being a lay preacher, though not affiliated with any church. And reading that was one of the first clues that he might have been an Anabaptist, because who meets in the home and who's the lay minister? He married Elizabeth Muma. They had 2 children, Christian III and Maria, married to Solomon Landis, outlived both of their children, living into their 70s, and they are buried on the farm in the Swartz Nissley Cemetery. Christian III was born on the homestead, educated in Middletown schools, and passed his life farming. He was a great lover of well-bred horses and always kept many about him, also acting as a veterinary surgeon, which always makes me think of Ed Swartz, the vet whose daughter bred quarter horses and Ed the longhorn steers. Christian III married Nancy Nissley, daughter of Martin Nissley, and they had 4 children. These Swartzes did not serve in the military, adhering to nonviolence precepts. And I note this, I cut a piece out of this thing because it was too long, but Private Johannes Muma did served during the Revolution, and Felix Landis, Private Felix Landis, whose home was in Hershey, he served militia and in the military during the Revolution. So here, again, this is my father's 1980 snapshot and a collection of photos from Reynolds' 1991 assimilation article. These were homes for the first Nissley generations buried in the Swartz Nissley Cemetery and within easy walking distance of the Swartz homestead. Johannes Nissley, Reverend, is thought to be perhaps the first deacon at the Muma Shoke Mennonite Church and to have given land to build a school. Nancy Nissley Swartz, the third generation, was probably raised in one of these homes by her grandfather, owned by her grandfather. Her parents, Martin Nissley and Fanny Landis, lived in Lower Swatara as retired farmers at least into their 70s. So you'll read in some articles that Martin and Fanny didn't want to stay on the farm, and that Martin, I think Reynolds says this too, I've seen it in a couple places, that Martin bought this place for her in Middletown so that she wouldn't have to be on a farm when she was an old woman, and so she got to sit in her parlor. And I mean, maybe that's true, but I can't find them on the Middletown map. The census doesn't indicate that. The census shows them still here as farmers, retired farmers in their 70s. So, like the Swartzes, these early Nissleys did not do military service. To us, as children, these three houses were all part of the same rural playground. We describe all these houses differently from Reynolds because we do it through our childhood memories. In 2018, during a family genealogy email exchange, I wrote, "So, Paul, I like that you remember crossing the stream. Approaching from Longview, passing the graveyard, the homestead would have been somewhat to your right. Off to the left, down another dirt lane from the main dirt lane leading to Fulling Mill, sat the house in the other photo, so this McClure house. When I was a child, the Herbster family lived there without electricity, I believe. There was a barn. They worked for the Messicks. I just heard from Tim, my brother, and he says that he is able to place both of those structures, these houses, on Google Maps, although both are now gone. He says that 1,000 feet north of the Herbster house, blah, 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 was the ruins of another stone dwelling. And I said, I remembered, because I said, I know there was another house that was a ruin, sitting by an orchard. No roof, tumbling walls with a root cellar beneath. He says there was a stone with the name Nissley and a date, but he can't remember the date. So these are the kind of visceral memories that we carry in play. We were always curious about these people who had lived in these ruins, but had only a vague sense that some of them might have been our ancestors. What did that even mean? It's just a wonderful place to play. So I included these Nissley homes you recognize and their connection to Nancy Nissley Swartz. And I was thinking her sons who were raised by their grandparents surely at least once got to walk up the hill and visit and be in this house. And it reminded me of being a child and knowing the Messicks and Messick Farm, and everybody knew that Grandma Messick would welcome you into her kitchen. And you know, our parents would always say, no, don't go up there, don't bother her. But she would let you in, and she had that wonderful big bulldog, Susie, and her kitchen smelled like vinegar, because that's how she cleaned. So let's look back to Switzerland. This section uses my trip photos and notes, sources I've cited previously, and some of Paul Swartz's family profile notes. Following the Protestant Reformation, which played out differently in every European country, radical movements emerged that wanted even more change. So the radical movement in Switzerland emerged around Zurich, up here, Zurich, Lake Zurich. So the first round of persecutions also were heaviest there. The Anabaptists, or Täufer, as they're called in German, from that area tended to leave early for the Kraichgau, Palatinate region of Germany, or for the Alsace in France. So I showed these on this map, this region up here north of Stuttgart where we lived, not quite to Heidelberg, stretching over to the Rhine. That's the Kraichgau, the Palatinate. And a lot of Germans came from there at that time, emigrated to the US. You probably know that. But this is the place where they fled, down here in the Alsace. I circled this place in particular because they were in this whole region. But right here is Saint-Marie-Amin, or Marcouk, which I'm going to talk about later on, and that is where the Amish division happened. So here we have Zurich. This is the Emmental, I'll mention in a minute, and over here in the mountains that were France, part of a bishopric, and are now part of Switzerland, that's the Jura. So later in time, the persecutions focused on Bern, particularly the Emmental area. Refugees from these later persecutions had the Netherlands also as an escape option. That's off the map. None of our ancestors, as far as we know, went there. And finally, in the last of 3 rounds of persecutions, the Jura Mountains, lying within the bishopric of Basel. Our families of interest were from both regions and eras of persecution and escape to France and Germany. The photos show a vineyard, lower left, in the Vosges Mountains of the Alsace, and the other in the Middle Rhine River in Germany, because that was their primary escape route. This map indicates where each family lived, the ones who lived around Zurich. So N up here is for Nissley. Landis is down here, fairly close to the lake, and then Gut, or Gut. My discussion will move from the upper left. So as I talk, I'm talking about photos here, the lake, Goods, Nissley, Landis. The beautiful eastern end of Lake Zurich has views of the snow-topped Alps, and there's a wooden pedestrian bridge to walk across the water. So you can actually walk across the lake, saves a lot of time. It's been in place in some form since the 12th century. It's a wonderful thing. The Goots could farm in peace in the rustic Affeltern, looking out over rolling hills until the first persecutions began. Magdalena Good Swartz was the 4th great-granddaughter of Andreas Gut, leader of Anabaptists of Lunern Attenbach. Those are the photos down in the lower left-hand corner. His wife's family, last name Bar or Bear, and they were another big Anabaptist family from down around the Landises. They left for the Alsace as early as 1648, and by the 1660s, they were living in Germany. In 1671, Andreas's descendants, Jacob and Peter Gut, lived in the Kraichgau in Germany. Peter Gut is recorded in Michaelsfeld near Steinfurt as an Anabaptist, and Nissley is later recorded in Steinfurt. So you see, they might have met ahead of time. We don't know, but these were small groups of Mennonites. When his son, Peter Gut, emigrated to America from Germany in 1727, among the members of his Mennonite congregation was Hans Brand. Remember, Brand was on that deed. Brand owned the land that became the Swartz homestead. I took a lot of this from an article about the 6 good families of early Lancaster County. The Newsleys take their name from a tiny rural village. This is tiny. It's like 4 tiny villages, and the whole conglomerate is still tiny. A tiny village, Newsburg, Nut Mountain, outside Winterthur. And they were concentrated in a few tiny surrounding villages. Some of them may have ventured closer to the lake on that northern side to worship with other brethren in the secret Anabaptist cave, which is pictured down below. The Lancaster County Nissley ancestors left Canton Zurich at some point and lived in Steinsfurt in the Kraichgau as part of a Mennonite community from 1661 until 1717, when they emigrated to Pennsylvania. Jacob Sr. and Jr., Nissley, are documented there. Hans Jacob Nissley was imprisoned. He was from near Newsburg. He was imprisoned in Ottenbach Prison, Zurich, as an Anabaptist in 1644. After about a year, he was released and went to the Alsace with 3 sons, one of them who was married. Their connection with the Jacob Nissleys in Steinfurt is unclear, but there's a huge Nissley effort. DNA and hiring a woman who translates old German documents from Philadelphia, so I'll have it figured out sometime. On the hills of Herzl, The half-timbered Landis enclave, that's a little, beautiful little place. So all of these were Nissley. This was Hans Nissley's, not Nissley Landis, Hans Landis's house. So this looks idyllic, as does the elegant hotel next to it, which is in Horgan. It was once a rod house, so the town hall, where Hans Landis was tried and convicted. He had already been imprisoned in irons, helped to escape, then captured again and examined regarding his doctrine. In 1614, he was beheaded in Zurich at the fish market. Fish market's about where those blue umbrellas are today. In view of the old cathedral, the last Anabaptist to be executed. Hans famously forgave his executioner as a final act. He is remembered in a plaque along the river, and it also memorializes the first Anabaptist execution. Next to this beautiful clear water, it's the clearest water I've ever seen. Nearby, the river was also home to a prison tower, which is no longer there, but that's the painting in the upper right. And that prison tower is where Hans' son, Felix, was imprisoned and died. He was deprived of food. Numerous Landis family members, men and women, were imprisoned for lengthy periods while their property was confiscated and sold. Then they were released and vanished. The remains of the family fled to Mannheim, Germany, on the Rhine River, and the Landis families here today are all, they're descended from 3 brothers who are all descendants of these 2 martyrs. So that is Zurich. On to Canton Bern and Emmental. Hoopla. So our hotel in the Emmental, in the Emmental had a big book that listed records for individual families, and it was in German, of course. So, but we were all determined, so we're taking photos and translating. I learned that my Swartz ancestors seemed content in this place, and they did not move very far. So they were first documented in 1288. It's a small family. There are still Schwartzes there. I asked the owner of the hotel, oh yeah, there are still Schwartzes around here. So these are all the places they were documented down here on the right. So in 4 centuries, they lived within a 35-mile circle. This is what I determined from that. Then they moved 50 miles during the persecution into the Jura Mountains, and they stayed there for half a century. And in 1754, they came here. So out of curiosity, I mapped our family's course in Pennsylvania. Brecknock Township, Lancaster County, stayed there 32 years, not quite 50. Stayed there 32 years, moved 50 miles, just like from Emmental to the Jura. Moved 50 miles and have stayed within a 36-mile radius for 237 years. Yes, some people have gone, but those of us who are here stayed, same radius, 237 years. We only have 63 to go, and it'll be just like Switzerland. My Swartz ancestors probably lived in a home that looked something like this. Dark in every room, from constant meat smoking, with workspace in every room. The children's bedroom doubled as a spinning and weaving center. The kitchen ovens protruded into the living and dining area, providing heat for the family and a place to dry laundry. And I'm amused because in the Reynolds article, she talks about Honorable John Nissley's house, which is down on the Masonic home grounds. And she describes the structure that is not characteristic German architecture. And she said, well, maybe it was a way to keep the 2 rooms warm at once and use the kitchen stove heat. That's what it is. And it is this typical Swiss sort of construction. So there's wonderful Alphorns that ring through the woods and have that deep resonant sound. Well, they were used during the period of persecution to announce when the Teufelsjägers were coming. These were Anabaptist hunters. They were bounty hunters. So they used their traditional horns, and then people would scurry to the places they knew were safe houses. So behind these peaceful farm villages, in the safe houses, they had constructed places, including barns that were built specifically, like they were designed to have a hidden room. And then some were quite primitive, like this hole under the ground, and people would be hidden there. This is a Longenecker farm, by the way, in the Emmental. Many Reformed families, including ministers, were Anabaptist sympathizers. The Emmental had the highest minister turnover because they were required to report Anabaptists at regular intervals. And yet these were usually peaceful farmers and good community members. They were able to request a new parish, and that is what many of them did, rather than have to report people. And that's based on research done by one of the women who owns the house in the second photo with the hiding room. This castle, Traxelwald Castle, was used as a prison from the Middle Ages until the 1970s. It was a prison for women in the 70s. It's incredible to me. Many Anabaptists were locked up here, including perhaps my 8th great-grandmother, Elizabeth Schenk Swartz. A lot of Schenks in the Emmental, and a lot of them were Anabaptists, and a lot of them were imprisoned. Not only ministers, but also their wives were likely to be imprisoned or persecuted in some way. They went to prison for crimes such as carrying messages between people and just helping or even feeding Anabaptists. Most surprising about this visit, the castle had a detailed museum where I learned new facts. I knew that my ancestor Jacob Swartz was a Brethren minister from Langnau, and that he was persecuted in 1692. We had read that in Richard Warren Davis's writing, so anybody who's researching Anabaptist ancestors, that's a book you want to read. Immigrants, Refugees, by Richard Warren Davis. But I always questioned whether this was true. I mean, it's just, I always wonder, okay, that was so long ago. Where did you get that information? Here it is in English. What did you read? Blah, 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 blah. And I wanted to know, what did the persecution consist of? Well, here I saw right in front of me in German, I saw the fact on a list, and then this map. So I don't know if you can see, but down here with the blue check mark, it says Swartz 1692. Okay, that would be Jacob. That was the year he was persecuted. Langnau is his home. Right here it says these are the persecuted people in Langnau. Well, a lot of them. And number 68. So here, Langnau, 68. Oh my heavens. He, his wife, and eldest son, Ulrich, were exiled. So the map showed the exact location of their property. And any of the people who are highlighted in yellow, it means that their house and their farm were confiscated and sold. So that's what happened to him. Well, I wanted to find that house. So the very nice Portuguese bus driver and the tour leaders let me do that. And I was so grateful. So here it is. And today it is an organic family farm that sells beef. And it just touched my heart that it had not been developed. It's on the edge of a little town, but you know, there is development in the town, but it is still a farm, and it was just so wonderful to see and know that it was still being appreciated and the land was being worked. So this one really surprised me because I did not have prior knowledge. There had been a similar confiscation of property from Swartz 20 years earlier, and that was the previous persecution period, but I didn't know about this one. So I don't know if this was Jacob's father, Hans, who was married to Breck Buell, another name to remember, or if it was Jacob, he moved down to Langnau, not very far away, but he moved and was targeted again. This is still not a complete map, but I just wanted to show you the scale. Like, this is not the whole map, and it's not all the people. But every one of those red dots is somebody who was recorded as being persecuted in some way. Some of them it'll say exiled, some highlighted, you know, their property was taken and sold. Some of them it'll say multiple forms of persecution. This is just horrible. And you wonder, was there anybody not being persecuted? Clearly there were people not being persecuted because they were the ones hired to hunt them down, but this is just amazing to me. So this list and a map are also interesting for the other names that appear. Jacob Schwartz's mother was a Breck Buell. So up here, this was the Swartz property near Suiswald that was taken in 1671. Up here was the Breck Buell property that was also confiscated. But down here, we also have two properties that were two brands. So the Brand family not only were brethren, but they were from this community. They were from the Emmental community. So you start to understand these people who bought land in Lower Swatara and then willed it to a group of people, made sure that Christian Swartz got this land. Their families go back a very long way. Is that what I wanted to say? Yes. Learning this information was all the more moving because of where we were staying for a few days. And that place was here, Sumisfald. Sumisfald is near what I just showed you on the map as the Swartz property. The Reformed Church in the upper right-hand corner was across the street from our hotel, completely characteristic of every Swiss Reformed church. They must be the same, they're meant to be identifiable, and they're just built in one way. I couldn't help wondering if my ancestors' confiscated property had helped pay for the earliest version of this one, since that is how the confiscated funds were often used. It was a little strange to know that as I walked out of town and looked into the valley, I was waiting for the cows to be brought down in the fall from exactly the spot where an ancestor was stripped of their property in 1671. It was like this wonderful cultural event. It's so much fun when all these cows come, but it was really eerie knowing when we walked out of town, all I had to do was look down that valley and up the hill. Like, that's the place. So this is that Abfahrt. They're traveling out of the Alps, and the cows are just beautiful. It's just a really, really big deal. I chose the walking photo on the lower left because of the children. I thought they were deer. But when I looked closely, I noticed they are family Reist. Well, Hans Reist is the Emmental minister who became the leader of the opposing faction in the Amish division. So that was just interesting. Almost done. Saint Marie-Amin, or Markkirk. Many details were under discussion in this community. So Jacob Swartz, they took his land, he and his wife and Ulrich. Ulrich apparently later went to North Carolina, but we don't know anything about him. But Jacob Swartz went to the Alsace. He went to the community where Jacob Amin was living, which suggests, they had something in common at the time. So they're both ministers. Jacob Amin was the elder, but they had a lot of disagreement. So the disagreements were about, like all of the ministers were disagreeing. Frequency of communion, Jacob Amin wanted to do it more frequently, and everybody else was fine with like twice a year or something. I'm not a religious scholar, so just bear with me. I'm telling you what I learned. Foot washing. Jacob Amin wanted to do that. Uniformity of dress, attendance at Reformed churches. Amin was really against that, and some of the other ministers said, it's not that bad. At least they're going to church. Tobacco use. The main issues of controversy were shunning, excommunication for speaking falsehoods, and whether one could say that true-hearted persons would be saved. Is a true-hearted person always saved? So this is what they fussed about. And Jacob Amin excommunicated several of the ministers from the Emmental, and Jacob Swartz was one of the ones he excommunicated. The first was Hans Reist, and then Jacob Swartz and a few others came later. So this went on and on. In 1694, they tried to have a reconciliation. There was a big meeting. Ministers from the Alsace, as well as ministers in Germany, just across the river, all these brethren ministers met together and tried to work out a compromise with Jacob Amin, and it just wasn't possible. So the ministers who disagreed with Amin, there were 16 of them, wrote a document explaining why they disagreed with his position, and they signed that document. Among the Swiss signers was Jacob Swartz, and among the Palatines were Hans and Jacob Gut. Good. So this tells you those two families had a connection long before Christian married Magdalena Good. By at least 1713, much of Jacob Swartz's family was in Europe. Christian Swartz, the immigrant to Pennsylvania, father of young Christian I, was born in Portemont in 1713. My day of hiking in the Jura, which is what these photos are from. It was a turning point in my understanding of my ancestors. The mountains are so steep, and the valleys are so close, and the towns are tiny, even today. I hiked all day, trying to reach the Anabaptist Bridge, which supposedly I should have been able to reach. I'm not in that bad shape. I knew it was going to take me longer than the hiking instructions said. I even had my son, the outdoorsman, look at the map and the elevation. Well, I just couldn't get there. I was afraid. I got up to the top of this hill, and I thought, well, I can still get down by dark, because it'll be faster going down. But I had to go down into a ravine to get to the Anabaptist Bridge, and I thought, why am I doing this? If I get down in the ravine, I'm gonna have to come up again, and let's just say I got close enough. What did I learn? Look at, you can see this path. Look at the trail. It's amazing. So it was supposed to be the Anabaptist Bridge, a meeting place for worship, but the terrain was so dense, and it was all steep and unforgiving. The land told me clearly that whatever else they were up to, this was not just about religion. These people were political dissidents, and that is the way that they were viewed. And my impression was confirmed later in Zurich on tour. That's not a critique of my ancestors. I'm just saying that is the way it was at the time. This was not just about how do you worship. This was basically about the fact that they wouldn't sign oaths, which meant they were effectively conscientious objectors. They couldn't be told to fight, and that was not okay. That's the persecution. But the land is what told me. So the Anabaptist immigrants from Europe, led by Ulrich Engel, left Switzerland in the spring of 1754. They spent several months traveling up the Rhine River to the port in Rotterdam. Others from Langnau, which is where the Schwartzes had lived, joined the group. They boarded the ship Phoenix, commanded by Captain John Spurrier. They sailed from Rotterdam in July, had one stop to resupply the Isle of Wight. The Phoenix was accompanied by 2 merchant ships carrying the cargo of the immigrants. A violent storm arose 3 days after leaving Rotterdam. The merchant ships were lightened in an attempt to save them. Sailing close by, the passengers saw what was being done. This was all recorded by a Mennonite minister. Some of the passengers leaped into the sea and swam to the merchant ships, hoping to save their belongings. The ship's crewmen cut off their hands as they tried to climb aboard the merchant ships. The frantic passengers fell into water and drowned in the sea. One of the merchant ships sank in spite of the efforts of the seamen to save it. The Phoenix sailed on, leaving behind many of the belongings of the immigrants on the bottom of the ocean. This 1754 Jura group was the first Anabaptist group to organize directly in Switzerland and leave there for America. Normally they stayed in Germany for a few generations. It was also one of the last Anabaptist groups to immigrate to America before the French and Indian War. According to Engel family tradition, during the weeks at sea, all the infant children died of dysentery, except their baby Jocheli Engel, son of Ulrich and Anna Breckbuhl Engel. All aboard agreed that God had a special mission for him in the New World. The Mennonite immigrants did not settle together, but they went to Lancaster, Berks, and York counties. The leader, Ulrich Engel, settled in Donegal Township, which is where the Nissleys, Donegal John, father of Johannes, Hans and Peter Swartz settled there as well. Here they could have met Donegal John Nissley and perhaps the Mumaw family before they moved into Lower Swatara. Another group settled on the border of Lancaster and Berks in Brecknock and Cumru townships near Adamstown. No Schwartz is on that list of names. However, we do know that Christian Swartz settled there in Brecknock Township as a young adult, and he was near the goods and the brands. Anna Breckbuhl was born and christened in Traxelwald, where we saw the castle, the prison. She married Ulrich Engel at Traxelwald in 1736. They were the parents of 8 children. They located at what is now called Wildcat, a station on the Pennsylvania Railroad, west of Marietta. They rest in a small burying ground on that old homestead. Their son Jocheli The infant who survived the crossing founded the River Brethren, if you've ever heard of that church. It's a denomination, and he was named their first bishop. The denomination was later renamed Brethren in Christ denomination. He was involved in their separation from the Mennonites, and he was father of another bishop, Daniel Engel. And Daniel Engel brings us back to Lower Swatara Township. He's up there in the corner in the elbow. He married Mary Landis, who just might be sister of Anne, who married Rudolph Martin, and they're buried in the Swartz Nissley Cemetery. Might be sister of Solomon, who married Maria Swartz, and Fanny, who married Martin Nissley. Done. Thank you for your attention. I don't know how to flip on lights. Are they on the left?
You're not a tech person.
Oh, no. I'm a call IT. I always had IT in my phone.
Yes.
Usually all I had to do was call them and it was fixed. It did something from a distance. So, do you have any questions? I went way longer than I thought.
I have one.
I'm really sorry.
I have one about the cemetery,
Yeah.
okay? It seems that many years ago, okay, when we drove out to the cemetery, there was a lane that you could turn in and park on. And I'm wondering if when you were looking at for what they meant by farm road or farm drive, if the person meant to use a lowercase letter and say turn on farm lane, which would have been a little dirt gravel road next to a field, not a titled road, not, you know,
Well,
just like,
there's
turn into the driveway.
there's a road along a line of trees. I don't know
Yeah.
if that's what you mean. It's at the end of there. It's like,
We drove in off of Longview,
yeah, there's a,
yeah, and we drove
There's like
on a dirt
yeah.
gravel
I don't
road.
know. You'd have to.
And so when you're talking about farm lane, farm road, to me, what I remember back then was just turning on to what I would call, if it was in a housing development, a driveway. This was a farm, a
Yeah,
lane for the
it's
farm.
possible. I mean, I don't
Yeah,
know.
I don't know, just a thought.
It's not a mile long, but
No,
I mean,
no,
who
it's
knows?
not, but it
Yeah,
might be if you're
yeah.
old
That could
and
be.
walking.
Could have just been a farm lane, not
Yeah.
farm lane.
If anybody wants any brownies, Jack still brought some, they're back here, you can help yourself.
Wow, that
He
was
often
nice of
brings
you.
brownies for us, and I just grabbed them this time.
Yeah.
Can you put up that map again that had the
How's
actual
that?
cemetery location on it?
Yeah. Let's see. I'm not sure how to click to the beginning, but if you can be patient, I will just go click, 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 click. But you want the actual map, because that'll be the
You
next
said that
slide.
was easiest to see, or was it on the picture?
Well, it depends on what's easiest for you. So that red dot shows you, you probably can't see the red dot now.
I can't do that.
I'll bet you can see it on the TV.
Yeah.
So that angle near the top, that angled road near the top of the screen is Longview Drive. And the houses on the left are the back end of Old Reliance. And then shooting off to the left will be Strites Road, but you can't really see it.
Anyway, they probably came down that old farm lane, that was used.
So right down at the bottom of the map, is that Fully Mill Road?
No, Fulling Mill Road is much farther down, so let me show you the previous one. So here's the map. I don't know if that helps, but if you look at parcel 16, so you can see, can you see that where I'm moving the arrow? I'm moving an arrow on the screen, it might not show for you. So parcel 16. At the bottom of parcel 16, there's a double red line, that's Route 283. Now the red line above that, going east to west, again, that's Fulling Mill Road.
So where's the cemetery?
So the cemetery is at the very back of parcel 16. So the end of parcel 16, the black line, it's in the middle of the field. So up here, here's Longview Drive, that red. Here's Old Reliance. Here is the back end of parcel 16, that's the back end of the farm. And the cemetery is right in the trees, right there. So the shortest way to get there is to walk in from Longview. But it's rough walking. And the farm lane that Mary Lou was talking about, there's like at the edge of the property, there used to be just a road. You could tell that trucks, farm trucks and tractors.
Would it be easier to go down Old Reliance and over, so
Yeah, the problem is you're trespassing, but that is, yes, the quickest way to get there is to go, I did it one time, but I wouldn't recommend doing it. I mean, I felt really bad, I was watching, I thought if anybody comes out, I'll talk to them and tell them why, but I think you could go knock on their door and say, do you mind if we walk between your properties? But that is the closest, and so that's the address that I gave you. It's, what is it, did I say Powderhorn? There's a circle. And so if you just go to that circle, walk between the two houses that lets you go right, it's a line of trees. You just go to the line of trees.
So the cemetery, what kind of shape is the cemetery in now?
So I haven't seen it,
Has anybody worked on this?
For a while. no. Yeah, I said the last time I went was during the pandemic, and it was covered with poison ivy. So we went, we took our tools, you know, we thought we were just gonna see what's still there. Because when I went, it was after the time that Reynolds wrote the article and said it was destroyed, there's nothing there. Yes, there were broken tombstones, and a lot of stones that were knocked over, but stood up. So I don't know.
Did they ever catch the kids that did that?
I have no idea. I don't know anything about that. So I think of it as, I mean, I think there's the stone wall is still there, and the gate was still there the last time I was there. But you would really, if you wanted to work on it, you would really have to just get rid of all of that poison ivy to make it safe for people to even go near. And then you could clear it out. My hope was sort of that if that place is developed, I think it would be a lovely place to have a plaque, and maybe the developer would do a pocket garden there as part of the community. I've seen places that do that, it's very nice. And I don't know what is left of the graves. So, yeah.
Ian, is it on private property?
Yes, it's on, I'm not certain of this, but what I've been told for years is that Hershey Creamery owns it.
But you being a relative of the people that are buried there, they have to let you on there.
I can tell you, I've walked out there and I haven't asked them. I don't go from Longview, I take a longer route. I used to walk my dog. So I'd walk that Ape Road into Stonehenge, so through the industrial park, and then just walk out the other end. And it's a place where no one wants to go there because you have to like fish through these streams. But that is the way I went as a child, so that is what I did. And I figured these industrial park is just people who work here, as long as I feel safe, and I did with the dog, what do they care that I'm walking on this property? And I'm sure Hershey Creamery doesn't. But walking through people's yards, yes, then I felt more uncomfortable about that.
We have to get to know the person that lives
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
If you know some people out there, I had a friend that lived near there, but she no longer does. But if you know people out there, I'm sure that they would let you go through their backyard. And my friend lived on Carriage House, but Powderhorn is quite near there.
Yeah, Carriage House is close.
Carriage, my friend lived on Carriage House. She would have let me walk through her backyard, but they've since moved. But if you know somebody out there, I'm sure they'd let you walk through the backyard.
Right, right.
And Glenn
I belong,
Evans,
I belong to something called Grave Concern, Inc.
Mhm.
It's in Lancaster County. They meet at Mennonite Life, every 3 months, and they do work on cemeteries like that.
yeah, so
But
Joanne
that's-
Segrist was
You're not
telling me
in
about that.
Lancaster County, we're not Lancaster County, of course, so
Yeah, I wondered, is there anybody else like that in Dauphin County that?
I don't think so. I'm not sure, but I've never come across anything. I've never Googled it or anything.
I think it's worth finding out more about.
Yeah.
Maybe next time we can do a field trip.
That would be fun,
It would be fun.
yeah. I would like that.
Yeah, how long did it take you to do all this research? I mean, it's amazing. I don't know what Lower Swatara Township would have done without your family.
Yeah. It would have been Lower Swatara Township.
I didn't realize you were connected to the Nissleys. You know, that's our
Yeah.
flagship.
Well, I think Reynolds says something about, and he married neighborhood girls or something. It's funny, but, so years and years. And I think Paul and Ed and I have been working on records together off and on for 5 or 6 years. But I mean, I've been interested long before that. Charlie Fees, I mean, that was communication with him in the late 90s. But really a lot in the last 5 or 6 years. And then when I went to Switzerland, that was like a whole new thing. The things that I found, that's just in the past year. So it's never ending.
Well, it was amazing. What
Thank
done.
you. It was fun. And I'm happy to help people who are interested in doing research. If you run into a wall, or if you just want to get started, you want an idea, where can I look for this? I'm happy to talk to you about it.
The one thing that I was surprised about is when you said that the one ancestor was beheaded. I always thought they drowned them.
Well, the first one was drowned, but they cut off his head with a
They
sword.
beheaded them too.
Yeah.
So, my ancestors came from there too, so.
I think many people, and you just don't know it. And I don't know if they just chose to not tell those stories because it was like you want to just move on and forget it. So, okay, well, thanks for your attention. Yeah.
I want to know what the name of that